everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Creation Biology. I'm your host, Emory Moynagh, and today we're going to be reviewing a video a video produced by the Paleologos YouTube channel. This is Peter Brummel. Now, I want to emphasize up front because I've not watched the video yet. I've just gotten through the introduction. That's why you're seeing a black screen at the moment, because I've basically gotten through his little intro, which is a cool little intro, by the way. He did an excellent. I don't know if he made that himself or what, but it's an excellent little intro. And I'm going to start the video here shortly. But the point I want to make is I want to emphasize up front, I don't dislike Peter. Matter of fact, I actually like Peter, and he's been very nice to me. And my interactions with him have always been pleasant. But I suspect that we're going to disagree very firmly on what a created kind is. And you know what? That's fine. We can disagree on that. However, I do think that it is important to point out that, this is nothing personal to Peter. I know where his sources are, and I don't agree with them. So that being said, let's go ahead and have a look at the video from Paleologos.
Hello and welcome. I'm Pete, and thanks for joining me today as I ask the question, what is a created kind? I want to begin by walking us through some of the relevant scripture passages. I also want to talk a little bit about how modern creationists conceptualize a kind, and then finally how we can use science to detect their boundaries. So let's begin by looking at some Bible passages. The first place in the Bible where it really talks about kinds is when God creates the plants on the third day of creation. So let's read Genesis 1, verses 11 through 13.
I'm just going to pause here and point out, I like this. Peter, thank you. Thank you for starting with the Bible. Thank you for starting with the Bible. Now, I suspect that some of the conclusions that you're going to draw are not going to be in line with what I myself would do, but thank you for starting with Scripture. A lot of people, and I don't know where you're going to go with this, I have suspicions, but a lot of people pretty much just ignore Scripture when they talk about what a created kind is. So thank you for starting there. That's a significant step in the right direction.
And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind." The Hebrew word which is translated as kind here is the word mean, and it denotes some kind of division, there being different types of things. And in context, it's saying that there are different types of plants that yield seed and different types of fruit trees which bear fruit. So these seem to be two general categories. The plants yielding seed, seems to refer to smaller plants that have a relatively bare seed, and then the fruit trees bearing fruit seems to indicate to larger plants that have a seed which is encapsulated within a fleshy fruit body. So what we see here is that there are different types of things right from the beginning, different types of plants, even within these broad general categories that are laid out here. Now, some creationists have interpreted this passage.
I'm just going to pause him here. He seems to have missed the fact that there's actually three groups here, not two. And I just want to read you the verse again real quick. The verse, I'm not reading from the same translation that he is, so that may be part of the difference. But according to verse 11 of Genesis 1, "And God said, Let the earth bring forth grass, and the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so." So I would suggest that there's actually three broad groupings here, not two. That's a minor nitpick, but I just wanted to point that out really quickly. And Peter might actually agree with that. He may have just missed it in his video. That could be, that might not even be something where we disagree.
As meaning that there is some connection to reproduction here. But I don't think that's the case. Let me read you this again. "The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind." Now certain people...
This is where I was expecting him to go. I'll let him finish his argument, but this is where I was expecting him to go. He's going to argue that the kinds are not reproductive groups. And unless he deals with certain other passages, which again, I've not watched the video, so I don't know exactly where he's going to go, I struggle to accept that. But let's let him finish his argument.
People want to interpret this as saying that the kind is referring to the seed which the plant is bringing forth, that it's the plant yielding seed which is according to their own kind. But I don't think that's what the passage is referring to. Instead, what it seems to be referring to is that there are different types of trees here. It's not talking about what type their seed is, although it is of course true that the seed is of the same kind as the parent plant. No, what seems to be the case is that there are different types of trees here and different types of plants that yield seed. And this is the case throughout the first chapter of Genesis. We hear about how the land-dwelling organisms are created according to their kinds, and it's not in reference to their reproduction once again. It's in reference to the way in which they're made. They're made according to their kinds. It's not talking about them bringing forth according to their kinds in this specific context.
Well, he might be right about plants, and if that was the only argument, I might be willing to accept it. Maybe. I still think that the kind does have some reproductive overtones, at least in this passage. But I think he's missing some particular context from this. If you go down to verse 21 of Genesis 1, what you find is, and I'm reading from the King James, not the ESV, so translational differences a little bit. But I don't think the ESV chops out, well, it does chop out some verses, but that's not one other kettle of fish. And God created great whales and every living thing that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let fowl multiply in the earth. Now God has just created various kinds of winged fowl and various kinds of water creatures and so on. And what does he immediately tell them to do? Reproduce. Fill the earth. Now that looks pretty soundly like some kind of reproductive connection. Right? Now, you might argue that it's not directly connected to the word mean, but it certainly seems that every kind that was created was told to reproduce. And we see this later when we get to the ark narrative, but we'll let Peter keep going, and we may come back to that. But I just want to point out, we see this later as well when we have animals coming off the ark, that they are reproducing after their kinds, and we'll come back to that. We'll let Peter continue on from here, though.
One passage which I think does draw a connection between the kinds and reproduction is Genesis 6, 19 through 20. And of every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark to keep them alive of you. They shall be male and female, of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds. Of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind, 2 of every sort shall come in to you to keep them alive. This passage comes near the beginning of the flood narrative. God has just warned Noah that he's going to send a flood, that Noah needs to build an ark, and now that all sorts of animals are going to come aboard that ark with Noah to keep them alive. But what's important here for our talk today is that the animals which Noah has to bring aboard come in pairs, 2 of every sort, and they have to be male and female. What's important here is that they're male and female, because Noah has to bring these animals aboard so that they can survive the flood and reproduce. Now, in the context in which it's being used here, that means that the kinds must be reproductively isolated, right? If there are different sorts of animals that Noah is bringing aboard the ark that could just interbreed, why would he need 2 of every sort? He wouldn't. He could take much fewer. No, the point here is that the kinds of animals which Noah is bringing on the ark are reproductively isolated, such that he needs a pair of both, because otherwise they would not be able to produce progeny. And I think that's the best explanation for why exactly Noah has to bring 2 of every kind and why they have to be male and female.
Peter, spot on. Well done. Well done. I must say that was a good explanation. I don't think I could have done better myself. That was a well done explanation. I must say that now. This is going to put you in the crosshairs of people like Ken Colson and Gene Leitner. I read Leitner's paper on the channel, and I've talked about Colson's argument where where they want to say that the ark kinds. Leitner's argument is going to say that the ark kinds weren't the same as the created kinds. Colson's argument is that the kinds may not have been reproductive groups, and this may actually tick off Matt McLean some too, because McLean has written that there may have been more than one type of crocodilian type on the more than one group within the crocodilian kind on the ark. So you may make a few enemies for this, but I actually will back you up on that. I think that's a very good reading of the text, and it shows you understand how, at least in this context, you understand how to read the scripture in context. And you'll find also this is also true in Genesis 8. You have the animals getting off the ark. You'll find that as they get off the ark, they're told that their things are going to reproduce. Right? You find that things are being told to reproduce. So it's actually verse 17 of Genesis 8. Bring forth with thee every living thing that is with thee, of all flesh, both of fowl and of cattle, and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, that they may breed abundantly in the earth, and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. Again, kinds are connected directly with reproduction. Now, does that hold true for Genesis 1? Well, I think it probably does. But maybe you want to make the argument that it doesn't. And maybe you can make this argument if you really want to, because the created kinds probably were more diverse than the ark kinds. So maybe not every member of every created kind could reproduce with every other member. Maybe. I don't think that's likely. It's not the way Scripture uses kind most of the rest of the time. But in the rest of Genesis, so I think within the book, the context would be pretty clear that it's a reproductive group. But if you wanted to make that argument, I suppose you could, and I wouldn't be quite as upset with you as perhaps I would be in other areas.
I think there's another passage which also has some interesting insights for us, and that's Genesis 2:18-23, so I'll read that now. Then the Lord God said, It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him. Now out of the ground the Lord God had formed every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all livestock, and to the birds of the heavens, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found a helper fit for him. So the Lord caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and while he slept, took one of his ribs, and closed up its place with flesh. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man he made into a woman, and brought her to the man. Then the man said, This at last is bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. One of the first observations which jumps out at me from this passage is that Adam needs a helper who is fit for him. God brings all sorts of birds and beasts to Adam, but none of them can be his helper. And that's because they're incompatible. Adam needs not only a sexual partner, one whom he can actually reproduce with. He can't reproduce with these other organisms. But he also needs one who is mentally fit for him and spiritually fit for him, on the same stage as him. And all of these creatures have low mental capacities. They don't have a spiritual capacity. They're not sexually fit for Adam. And that's why he needs a partner who is of the same kind as him. And so what does God do? He takes actually a piece of Adam, one of Adam's ribs, and he makes the woman out of the rib, maximizing the similarities between Adam and his wife, Eve. Speaking of Eve, it's important to...
Before he jumps into that, I agree with most of what he just said. I'd never actually really thought about a lot of it. But I do think that the argument saying maximizing the similarities between Adam and Eve, I'd like to see that fleshed out a little bit more, because does he mean genetically? Does he mean just in appearance and compatibility? I'm not entirely sure, and it is somewhat off topic for the video, but I'm not entirely sure what he means, so I can't quite endorse that because I don't know quite what he means. I suspect that he's following his mentor Todd Wood's ideas about post-flood diversification, thus would not follow Dr. Jeanson's ideas about created heterozygosity. Here and I would differ probably. That said, I do think that Peter could flesh that out a little bit, but as a general statement, it's probably okay. I just would like to know a little bit more detail on that.
Note that wasn't actually her name yet. We only hear of her being named Eve, which means mother of all living, after the fall. Here, Adam simply names her woman, which is more of just a categorical name, a type of person. He is a man and she is a woman, different types. And that seems to be the same way in which Adam named the other creatures which God brought to him. when God brought the birds and the beasts to Adam, he wasn't giving them personal names like Fluffy and Bowser or things like that. He was giving them categorical names, it appears, which is how this is actually a manageable task. And so when giving all of these names, it appears that this is an exercise of dominion, right? God had given Adam dominion over all of creation, and Adam exercised it by naming the creatures, right? We name things which we own. And so there's a certain amount of control, of dominion exercised in naming these animals here that God brings to Adam. And I think it's also interesting that Adam is able to name them all. God doesn't seem to really give him ideas or direct him in this, but Adam simply knows what to name these different creatures. And so it appears that there's some intuition, and creationists have argued that this can be the basis for our understanding of kinds.
Before he goes any further, because I don't want to run this for too long without my commentary, I agree with most of what he just said there. There might be a few minor differences. He's about to go into the cognitive method of establishing what a created kind is. I think this is somewhat useful. I'm going to let him describe it and go through that, and then we will come back to my commentary on it. But so far, I mean, generally speaking, we're not too far off. Maybe we probably will get less close together as we get further on. But for now, he's done a fairly decent job with handling of Scripture. So bravo, Peter. Well done.
That there's a certain amount of intuition that comes along with the different types of creatures which God made. So in the Bible, it talks about how God makes these different kinds of creatures, but there's so much diversity that we hear about in Genesis already, right? We hear about there's fruit trees, we hear about these trees that bear seed, and then there's passages I didn't read about all of the types of swimming creatures and flying creatures and creeping things and beasts that God creates. So we have a lot of different types of things already present here at the creation according to the Genesis account. And so it seems that God created an abundance of different types of organisms right from the very beginning here. Hybridization.
Okay, I was wrong. Apparently, he doesn't jump into the cognitum. That would have been my immediate transition point. But before he gets into the hybridization question, I would agree that God created a lot of diversity. I might even say created heterozygosity. Just a point. But in all seriousness, I would agree with most of what he just said there, and we'll see what he says about hybridization. Now, I will also point out here that many of the people who are involved in baraminology today are not fans of hybridization, but they don't use it very much. They might say that, though, yeah, that's something that's good, useful data, but they don't ever use it or hardly ever use it. The few times that it has happened, it's ended up counteracting a lot of the claims that are made by baraminologists. So maybe that's why. I don't know. Not in their minds. I can't tell you. But anyways, let's hear what the rest of what Peter has to say.
Is a way in which we can tell which organisms belong to the same kind. The Bible seems to indicate that creatures which can interbreed belong to the same kind. Creatures from separate kinds cannot interbreed. Now, the issue here is that it's only an additive criterion. That is, if two organisms can interbreed, then they must belong to the same kind. But if they can't interbreed, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't belong to the same kind.
He's arguing that hybridization is only an additive criterion here. That's not strictly true. That's not strictly true. It's strictly true if we only mean things that produce offspring that, live and survive and grow. But Leitner and others have done work talking about hybridization going on in situ with it, and the development of certain stages of the zygote are enough for a hybridization criterion. I'd like to see some more research into this. I'd like to see Leitner did the original work on that. Siegfried Schur, I think, did some work on this as well. I'd like to see some more research on that. I think that would be very interesting and very useful to the creation movement to get some more work done on that, because it would stop being an additive criterion. It would be also a negative criterion in the sense that, hey, we can do this in vitro and we get good results. So that'd be something I'd be interested in seeing a little bit more of. I don't think Peter will get into that. I'd be surprised if he does. There's only 9 minutes left in his video. But I would be interested in seeing that because, again, I think there's some good potential information there. So we'll let Peter continue.
And that's because speciation has happened. Creatures have become so genetically different from each other and even morphologically distinct that they can no longer interbreed anymore. And so there's limited usefulness to the criterion of hybridization.
Well, I would agree if the definition of successful hybridization is producing offspring that survive. If the definition is different, if you look at a zygotic level, which is what Leitner did in her study, and which Scherer has done as well, and even Frank Marsh had looked at this a little bit back in the 70s and 80s, I think. And if you look at that a little bit more, I think that hybridization is going to be a much better criterion than he's giving it credit for. But again, I doubt he's ever read the papers on this particular topic. So I'm not going to rip him too much, but I do think that hybridization is a much more useful criterion than he's currently giving it credit for. And Peter, if you watch this video, mate, feel free to reach out. I can point you in the direction of the papers I'm talking about. They're a little bit hard to find because they're kind of old, but I think there's some useful information if you'd like to read it.
Creationist Frank Marsh played an influential role in developing the Christian understanding of biology.
Side note. Round of applause for mentioning Frank Marsh. Round of applause for mentioning Frank Marsh. A lot of people in the Baraminology community don't talk about Marsh anymore, in part because he was a Seventh-day Adventist, in part also because, well, he died in like 1992. So it's been 30 years since he died. People tend to forget. So, brownie points for you for mentioning Frank Marsh.
And he developed the word Baramin, coined from two Hebrew words. One is bara, which means he created, and the other is min, that one that we looked at, which means kind. And so from him, we get the idea of the created kind. Now, there's different ways in which creationists have conceptualized created kinds. One of these is species fixity, the idea that species do not change over time. This is not only obviously wrong from what we know about biology, but it's also biblically problematic because there are way too many species of birds and land-dwelling creatures than could fit on the ark. In other words, it simply doesn't work. Now, there's another...
I'm not entirely sure why he brings up species fixity here. Because species fixity has been dead letter within the young Earth community for a long, long time. And even Carl Linnaeus, who sort of gave us the idea of a species, didn't believe in species fixity by the end of his life. So, now I know this is the popular canard that we all get attacked with, but I can't think of anybody within the young Earth community who believes in fixity of species. There are a few people in the old Earth community who believe that, but they can afford to because they don't have a global flood that has to cover or have all the animals. They have this local flood garbage. So I'm not entirely sure what the point of that is, but I mean, okay, it's a useful historical footnote, I suppose. But no one in the young Earth community believes in fixity of species. At least no one of any prominence. There may be a few people in a church somewhere that believe it, but none of the scientists believe it.
Another way in which creationists conceptualize kinds that is more accurate, and this is the idea of the creationist orchard. And that is that rather than having a single tree of life where all creatures are related, we have lots of little trees. God created these initial populations of organisms which have diversified since then. So there's been new origin of species. Species are not constant.
This is the diagram that Peter just put on screen is a really good diagram, and it illustrates the concept of creationist orchard very well. There's no common ancestry, except within kinds. There's no ultimate tree of life that encompasses all organisms. So that diagram is really helpful, and thank you, Peter, for putting that up. That's a good way of explaining things. I think, if I heard correctly, he might be about to go into Robert Carter's braided baronome. If he is, well done, Peter, because that is a really cool concept, and I'm really excited that you're going to talk about it.
The braided baromen concept is a more recent addition by Dr. Rob Carter, and it simply recognizes the possibility that God created populations of organisms and not pairs in the beginning. It appears that God only created pairs of humans, and these other types of organisms probably started with whole populations intact already. And what appears to have happened then is that at the flood, Noah may possibly have taken organisms from different populations, and because they belong to the same kind, aboard the ark with him. Or he may have even sampled multiple populations within the same kind and taken them all on the ark with him then. In their paper,
All right, I want to address Carter's paper before we get into the refined Baramian concept by Wood, Wise, Sanders, and Duran. Roger Sanders, by the way, is deceased. He passed away, I don't know, 2-3 years ago. Maybe it was longer ago than that. COVID kind of distorts your time. But the other three gentlemen are still alive, as far as I know. I know that Kurt Wise and Todd Wood are still alive. I don't know very much about Neil Duran, so he may not still be alive. But he was still publishing as of a few years ago, so I suspect he is. The point though being, before we get into the refined Baramian concept, I like Carter's ideas to an extent. We need to read his paper on the channel, so we need to read those papers. So before we, I do want to point out though that he's done an excellent job explaining that there could have been more. There could have been a population of organisms at creation. Carter wrote a paper on it, and then I read it and I thought, wow, that just makes sense. Why didn't I think of that? Like I'd never really thought like beyond the like, okay, well, how many did God create at the beginning? He created 2 humans, but like how many did he create of everything else? Well, we just don't know. And so I like Carter's thinking on that. That's really, really good. And I'm gonna let him get into the refined Baramian concept. I suspect that this is where we're going to start to disagree.
Revised Baramian concept, Doctors Wood, Wise, Sanders, and Duran look at the definition of a kind and develop a new definition of a kind. They define a Baramian as the actualization of a potentiality region at any point or period in history, including but not limited to all of history. Now that sounds very theoretical, so what exactly does that mean? Well, we have to understand the idea of biological character space. That is, that organisms have different traits about them, right? We can have blue eyes, we can have brown eyes, we can have different types of colored hair, we can have different skin tones, we can have different bone shapes. And each of those traits is what we call a character, and that's what we use to build character matrices, which are basically these whole collections of data that describe exactly what features an organism has.
And the character matrices that are used for statistical baraminology are utter rubbish. I've played with them. I can, just like with any phylogenetic data set, you can make them say anything you want if you play with them enough. And I've also done some work with these when I was reviewing McLean's paper on feathered dinosaurs. It turns out that there are differences in the way that these character traits are perceived by the 2 different algorithms that exist. BDMDS, that's the word, that's the phrase, and the new Barclay system. Those are they perceive the characters differently, and it gives you slightly different results. Not necessarily majorly different, but they are slightly different in some cases. There's also some other issues with the character set. A lot of them are really missing a lot of characters, or they're built, and particularly in the hominin line, they're built to show that the humans evolved from X thing or Y thing or whatever. And it's also very difficult to define traits. How do you define the presence or absence of high cheekbones? What's a high cheekbone? Like, these are questions that need to be asked, and they are not being asked. And Peter, I don't expect Peter to ask these questions, although he has published in the Statistical Baraminology literature as a co-author with Todd Wood, so maybe he needs to ask these questions. I mean, if he's going to put his name on a paper, he probably should ask these kind of questions. So, again, that's not necessarily a criticism of Peter. It's more along the lines of we need to be more careful with what we're playing with in terms of character matrices.
Now, in biological character space, this is the idea that we can theoretically think of this space where it's a multi-dimensional space where every single dimension is a different character, and we can plot within this dimension where different organisms are, right? So one organism can have this trait, another organism can have this trait. And when we add up these dimensions, we can think of these different types of species as basically these dots floating within this character space, and their position in this character space tells us what traits they have.
There is a big assumption with that, and that is assuming that the arrangement of the traits matters nothing. And that's probably not true. As a matter of fact, I almost guarantee you it isn't true. I could probably give you a lengthy description of an organism listing off the traits, but if I don't tell you how they're put together, you probably can't tell me what it is, even if you're an experienced taxonomist. So the fact that the arrangement of parts is not considered in this is... Now, I'm not entirely sure how you would consider arrangement of parts, and this may be the best of a bad lot, I don't know. But I am concerned that the arrangement of parts is not taken into account in this scheme. And also the multidimensional scaling is, which is what he just showed you, is completely arbitrary. You can make it say anything you want. I can show you how this is done. It's really, really simple and really, really easy. All you need to do is just completely change the axis a little bit. And maybe I'll do a video or a live stream at some point explaining how multidimensional scaling is just a complete farce. The place where you put things may be interesting, but you can rotate it on its axis to make it say anything you want. Anything at all.
Now, by understanding this, then, we can think about their idea of the potentiality region, which is that there's an area in which organisms can basically diversify into. So there's basically a starting area where this population, original population created by God, begins, and they can diversify outwards into this region of this three-dimensional space where there are traits that they can gain. In their view, the potentiality regions of different kinds are separated from one another, such that as each kind diversifies, they cannot grow into one another, such that they would have the exact same traits or interbreed with one another. The kinds remain separate from one another. And I don't think that there may actually be a hard boundary stopping the created kinds from growing into one another as they diversify. Rather, I think that this may just be the rarity of convergent evolution. That is, once you have these two populations, it is very, very unlikely that they would actually get the exact same character traits as one another. And so we have this idea that there are different groups of organisms that represent and fall into different areas of biological character space. Now,
He's just said a lot there. The biological character space and so on, I kind of dismissed that out of hand. I do like the fact that they're trying to argue convincingly that there's no way to overlap between the created kinds. Okay, cool, fine, that's interesting. And I actually find his approach to saying that maybe there's a limit to convergence. It's very unlikely for two groups to diversify into the same traits. Interesting, the exact same traits, that is. Interesting, I'm not sure it's persuasive. And the reason I say is I'm not sure it's persuasive is genetics is somewhat determinative. Not completely determinative, but it is somewhat determinative, particularly in the animals. And so there's hard genetic caps with what organisms can do. And even mutations can't change that because eventually you'll break essential functions. So I think his idea that there's no hard cap between the kinds, but they can't get there because of convergence is interesting. It's probably wrong. I think the hard cap is probably genetic. But it's interesting, and I appreciate him thinking outside the box in that regard. So his video was 18 minutes long, and we've gone for almost 35. So we'll try and speed this up just a little bit.
Different ways that we can kind of actually try to look at this theoretical concept and see if the scientific data that we have lines up with this way in which we envision the created kinds. And one of those is through statistical baraminology. So what we can...
Statistical baraminology is a raging dumpster fire. I don't know if he's read... Well, no, he has, because he did a video on it, and I need to respond to it. He's read the Sanders and Cherhadi paper that showed you just what a dumpster fire it is. But I can tell you from using the statistical tools themselves, they're garbage. They're garbage. They're only as good as the data you put in, and even the data you put in has significant problems. So I think I need to read the Sanders and Cherhadi paper on the air. I think that's what needs to happen. So that'll be the next episode, or maybe I'll do Walter Remind's discontinuity systematics first. But I'm going to read these papers on the air and let you all hear them and learn from them. So, Peter, if you want to talk about statistical baraminology, feel free. Shoot me a message, whatever. You know how to get in touch with me. But I don't think you and I are going to agree because, well, I'm a rando on the internet and you're friends with Dr. Wood. So, yeah, easy enough.
Is we can get these character matrices that have all of these lists of these different types of characters, and we can analyze them using statistics to look at how similar organisms are to one another. And based on this model, what we would predict is that organisms are going to appear in clusters. There's going to be a whole cluster of organisms within a created kind, but they're going to be separate from other kinds. that it would be that there are all of these separate individual clusters. And this space between them we would call discontinuity. These different kinds are morphologically discontinuous with each other. And we would say that the organisms within these created kinds, these little clusters, are continuous with each other. They form this little region where they are all sharing many, many traits with one another.
The problem with discontinuity and continuity, as much as I like Remind's discontinuity systematics, is you have a scaling problem. When you, at least when you play it through the statistical baraminology lens. If I put humans, gorillas, chimpanzees, and so on, all the other great apes, into a data set, and I do everything fairly, I don't try to bias it toward evolution or anything like that. If I put all those things together in a data set, and then put in all the lemurs and put in all the other monkeys, and then also put in, we'll put in the mustelids, which is the weasels, the otters, etc. If we threw all that into a data set, you have a scaling problem, because your lemurs are probably all going to cluster, probably. Your other monkeys may all cluster. You may get 2 clusters, I don't know. You'll probably get the mustelids as their own cluster. They're the out group, if you will. And then you'll get humans, chimps, gorillas, orangutans, and possibly the gibbons, all in one group. And I know this because I've done something similar using an evolutionary created data set. There is nothing I can do to separate apes from humans using that data set. I think we did a video on that previously. So the point being, there's a scale problem here. And I don't know how you solve that scale problem, but it exists, and we can't pretend that it doesn't. Maybe we need to limit it to organisms within a particular family, and only within that family, and then use something else as an outgroup. I don't know. But that seems like you're deliberately stacking the deck at that point. So I don't know how you solve that particular scaling problem. I'm thinking about it. But discontinuity and continuity, as much as I like the idea, is not the final answer. It can't be the final answer because of the scaling problem.
This here is a distance correlation graph, and it's one of the ways in which we can visualize this continuity and discontinuity. The black squares here represent significant continuity. That is,
who defines significant? I know it's statistically defined, but, is it 95% similar? Or is it 75? Or is it something else? I mean, they use a bunch of different cutoffs for their data. So what is it, 95, 90, 70? I mean, how do we know? How do we know? And by the way, most discontinuity and continuity distance correlation graphs that you see do not look this good. Right now, that one looks practically bloody perfect. Most of them are messy, ugly, nasty. Now, maybe this particular one is the way. I'm not doubting that this particular one turned out that way, but I got news for him. If you've played with them as much as I have, most of them are really messy and really ugly, and there's not perfect continuity overlaps the way there are in this one. And if you want to read the In His Image blog, there's a bunch of different examples, critique where I've reworked McLean's work, and it's obvious. It's obvious that they're not the same. They're messy. They're ugly. And I'll try and maybe I'll link to a few of those in the video description.
Organisms are very similar, and the circles that are clear indicate significant discontinuity. So when you come to a point where two species are being compared, if there's a square, it means they're very similar. A circle means they're very dissimilar. And what we can see is we have 3 main groups that fall out here. You can see these arrows that I've added point to the place where Saxonella naylori is compared to itself on the graph. And as you can see, there is a black square there, because it turns out when you compare Saxonella naylori to Saxonella naylori, it's exactly identical. There's significant correlation there. And that is what basically that whole diagonal line going up the center of the graph is. It's where you compare each species to itself. Of course, they're going to be identical, and so there's a black square there. But what's more interesting is how you see these separate groups, right? Lots of those species on the left-hand side of the graph are very similar to one another, and they form kind of a block. And then there's another block right above that where many species correlate positively with each other as well. This is another way of visualizing this character space. What we see.
So what he just showed you, I went and looked up a couple of the species. The species are extinct primates. And because they're extinct primates, the data set's probably really messy. I haven't seen the data set, but I would suspect from my experience dealing with these, the data set's probably really messy. Which means they probably used a 75% cutoff, which is not very good and leads to a lot of mistakes, shall we say, or potential mistakes anyway. What he's showing you on screen now is an MDS plot. What he probably is not going to tell you is you can rotate that any way you want to create any answer that you want. So if you rotated that the right way, it would look like there were not a couple of groups there. There was only one group, or maybe only two groups. I don't think he'll tell you that. He may not even realize it himself, but that's the fact. That's a fact, and I can demonstrate it on a live stream in front of as many people as we want, anytime we want.
Here is a multi-dimensional scaling plot. So earlier we talked about biological character space, where each of these traits comes up with a new dimension. But the problem is we can't actually look at things in more than 3 dimensions. Well, it's very hard to go beyond that. So what this tries to do is take those many dimensional coordinates and turn them into 3-dimensional coordinates without changing the way in which they would be seen as little as possible, and then plotting them within a 3-dimensional space so that we can see where these taxa are relative to one another, and we can try to look at different clusterings of taxa to try to understand how similar these organisms are to one another and whether they fall into groups as we would expect or not. This is the medoid partitioning silhouette plot, and it helps us understand this continuity and discontinuity as well.
Now the medoid partition plot is interesting. The problem with this is you pre-select how many groups you think are there. And you may also notice that Africanus is pretty far away. I'm assuming that the red one that's way away from everything else might be Rudolfensis, perhaps, or perhaps Sediba. I'm not entirely sure. He's effectively trying to argue that Australopithecus sediba is part of the human group, and it's not. It's just simply not. It doesn't match up with the anatomy at all. But according to statistical baraminology, it does. At least according to this, anyway. But again, you pre-select how many groups you think there are in the data. And I don't think that... And again, I'm not saying that they're being deliberately dishonest or anything like that. That's not what I'm trying to get across at all. But you pre-select, and that opens the door. It doesn't look good. And bare minimum, it doesn't look good. So I'm not a huge fan of this for that reason. I would like to see more... I'd like to see better methods developed where you don't have to pre-select group numbers.
What this does is it basically tries to evaluate how well these different organisms fit within the clusters that they fall. So you can actually specify with this type of plot how many different clusters you want the taxa to fit into. And you will see that if you would try to force all of these in taxa here into like 2 clusters, it wouldn't work very well. Whereas when you fit them into 3 clusters, they actually fit very well. And you can see down here at the bottom a silhouette width, which is a measure of how well these taxa group together into a cluster. So from an evolutionary perspective, where all life is related, what we should see is that all organisms are continuous with one another. There's a morphological continuum between every type of organism. But that's not what we see, and that's not what creationism would predict. A creation model would predict that there are instead clusters of organisms that represent separate created kinds. Now this video has barely scratched the surface, and I haven't even gone into a lot of the objections, which some skeptics will have. That's something that I'll hopefully get into more in the future, and I have a lot of notes here that I would really like to cover at some point. But I hope this has given you at least a general basic idea of what a kind is, how creationists think about them, and how we can detect them. So thank you for watching.
All right, we're not going to play his outro. I'm sure it's a very cool outro, I'm sure, but we're not going to play it on screen. Again, Peter, please don't take this personally. This video is not an attack on you, and I agree with a lot of the things you said in this video. But I don't agree with the statistical baraminology of Todd Wood and the one that you are therefore promoting. I note that you did not mention any of Dr. Matthew Cherhadi's work in baraminology. Any of the heat mapping work that he has done. You mentioned none of it. And that is a rather serious oversight. If I'm being honest, that's a rather serious oversight. Now, you may mention it in a future video. I don't know. But the fact that you didn't mention any of Cherhadi's research tells me you either need to do some more research or you need to have a separate video, or maybe you're planning on this, I don't know, have a separate video discussing it. And if you want me to point you to papers, I can point you to papers. I can probably get Cherhadi to because I've co-written on a paper with Chirhadi. I can probably get Chirhadi to send me PDFs of his papers, if you want to read them. All right. You really need to discuss his work if we're going to talk about what a created kind is and how we delineate one. You can't just say, well, you just can't grab Todd Woods and say, well, this is the only way in town. It isn't. It is not the only way in town. And it's a way that has been criticized, which you did not deal with. Now, I know you say you're going to deal with objections later. I doubt you'll deal with the specific objections raised in the Sanderson-Chirhadi paper. If you do, that'd be great. I'd love to see that. But the video that you did previously on that paper didn't address any of the actual objections in the paper. It just went on to discussing some of the stuff that Wood had done post-paper, which is fine. I'm sure that's very interesting stuff, but deal with the actual objections to the paper. And we may read that paper on the air at some point. All right, this video I think has gone on long enough. We're almost at 50 minutes. I wasn't planning on going that long. I was planning on recording 2 videos, and I only get to record 1 tonight. So anyways, thank you all very much for tuning in. Peter, thank you for your work. I know that I don't agree with you on everything, but you've done us a helpful service here by putting some of the stuff you said was spot on, so well done on that. I do urge you to reconsider your support for statistical baraminology. I don't expect you will, but hey, a man can try. Anyways, thanks everyone. Have a wonderful night. See you all next time.